a saint, a devil, like this sort of classic. Like there's no greater, with the exception of Larry Ellison, there's no better image of the kind of techno CEO asshole. And at the same time, people feel about this guy like he's some kind of spiritual visionary who somehow crafted something that touches the depths of the human spirit. It's like, how do you reconcile these images? I mean, even as a CEO, the guy, he never gave any money to anybody. I mean, he was a real jerk in a lot of ways, and yet there was this sense of adulation around him, which was really, the paradoxes go all the way through.
Well, and just to add into, in addition to that, Eric, at the time, back in the day, I was on a lot of chat rooms, and I knew a lot of the hackers that were involved with this site called the Cult of the Dead Cow. And a lot of them saw Apple as, like you said, it was like this control mechanism because it didn't use code, and they felt like it actually gave less control and not this kind of liberating thing like he was trying to present, but rather that it was this tyranny because people would lose the ability to code and understand computers by using Macs because they would be, a little lazier because it was all done for them. So it's funny, like that, feeds into what you're saying.
So where does this paradoxicality come from, Brett?
Well, I think there's two things to point out. One is that when one tries to make a claim like this, that Apple has this religious resonance, that in one sense the paradox is what gives it that resonance. If you think about religion, it's filled, and that's Buddhism, that's Christianity, Hinduism. That paradox really is at the heart of many of these belief systems, and that's what makes them so fascinating and so hard to pin down. So there's that element, which I don't know was a sort of conscious idea on Jobs' part. What was conscious on Jobs' part was his formation in the humanities and the liberal arts in the Eastern spiritual traditions in his early years. And in particular, a course he took at Reed College after he had dropped out. He still took courses, and one of the courses was on William Blake's poetry, and the professor had, I think, a profound impact on Jobs. He was very interested in Buddhism, and Blake himself, William Blake, the Romantic poet, was interested in Buddhism, one of the first translators of Buddhist texts. And his poetry was filled with paradox. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell is the classic kind of example that he saw heaven not as sort of the place of the good and hell the place of evil, but both were expressions of human kind of impulses and desires, and together, kind of in harmony, they form the entirety of reality. And so there was this notion that there was this poetic idea that we could resolve the paradox or create experiences that the yin and the yang are brought together. And I think Jobs tried to express that creatively through the advertising, through the product design, that these two worlds could coexist. And as you mentioned, some of the slogans, for some of the products that I mentioned in the last, chapter, the iPod Shuffle, random is the new order, the PowerBook, less is more, touching is believing for the iPhone. So these kind of contradictory ideas being brought together rhetorically. But then, as you say, and as Aja says, all these other levels in which technology attracts kind of the paradoxical thinking. And one of the other influences I should mention that got this project started was Umberto Eco's famous essay on Mac being Catholic and DOS being Protestant, and I think it speaks to what Maja was talking about. Eco was a semiotician, looked at semiotic signs, symbols for meaning, and he kind of tongue-in-cheek looked at Mac and Apple as Catholic because it was full of icons, this lush iconography, and you didn't have to really understand computers to understand how to use a Mac, just like a medieval illiterate could understand the Catholic faith just by walking into a cathedral and being surrounded by its imagery and the music and so forth. Whereas DOS or Windows later had a more kind of a Protestant idea that you had to understand the text and you had to understand the code. And so I love that you point that out, that that Apple is obscuring the code in a way, that that there's a certain there's something really fascinating about that.
That's a really good comparison, actually. Church, the Catholic Church, because it's kind of true. They take away the understanding and discipline, right, and then just make it easily accessible.
And it's,
right.
It's really important to highlight just how radical that shift is, and then how much the sort of the Apple Catholic model won in a lot of ways. I mean, in that, eventually later iterations of Windows and indeed all the devices we have now are so increasingly icon-driven. People are scared of terminal windows. People don't want to look at a command line. And even the devices themselves are becoming increasingly less text-based. So the whole move away from code, linearity, textuality in our interaction with computers is, it's a massive shift. And then if we remember the way that the Protestant would see it, in this language, or the cult of the dead cow, where you're like, look, every step we take away from understanding how these machines are actually operating beneath the surface, every step we take away from that, we're disempowering ourselves, however much it looks like we're actually being empowered to do X and Y. And there's another paradox that lies at the heart of Apple, is that on some level Apple's saying, trust us, we're able to design an experience that maximizes you and what you want to create. But we do that partly by not giving you the maps and the tools to deal with what goes on behind the curtain.
Right, and you see these movements now, for especially in early education. Now they're online programs trying to get children to and adults to learn to code. I mean, there's these very engaging kind of online tutorials, and people like Douglas Rushkoff, who are really being an advocate for learning how to program, because I think rightly so, there's a concern and anxiety that, culture's kind of bifurcating into these two camps where you have the programmers and then the programmed, right? So if you don't know how culture is being programmed at the code level, then how much input do you really have? As you say, you have this sort of false sense of creativity and empowerment and participation because you're able to click the icon or play the game. But what's going on behind that? And I think metaphorically speaking, just the addiction to these devices in general is a certain type of cultural programming. That social patterns, cultural patterns are changing as a result of our this constant, pervasive, persistent use of these devices.
And again, just to keep up on the paradoxes, I was going down, driving I live in the Bay Area, so there's a lot of advertisements. It's very, tech and Bay Area spirituality mixed together, and you see it relatively regularly. And there was an ad for some new information backup service that used Zen. I can argue, so you thought, there was the Zen word, and it had this sort of Japanese traditional background, and it's so ironic that if you think of what's one of the things you associate, what kind of consciousness, what kind of mind do we associate with Zen, with sitting, with quiet, with contemplation, with open spaces, with this very slow sense of duration, with the no more activity than a single bird flying in the distance, and yet the reality of our engagement with technology is just this constant cutting, of slicing, of shifting frames, of being, dosed by these little blasts of data or incoming information. That it's like you can't imagine a bigger engine for the monkey mind in meditation terms. So we can see the way that the sort of dreams of the Buddhist meditator or of the yogi, and yoga is so big in the same kind of world, you can see the way it's trying to balance out a much more problematic, potentially addictive, certainly distracting, certainly scrambling kinds of effects of what these machines actually do in the fabric of our ordinary lives.
Yeah, and you have these conferences out there, too, that are getting fairly mature now, like the Wisdom 2.0 conference, where they teach mindfulness to tech executives, people that work in tech. And then there's, and I mentioned in the book, the Waldorf School in the Bay Area, where sons and daughters of Google and Yahoo and Apple execs are going to a school with no computers. So there's an awareness even among those creating the products and these objects of desire that there needs to be an antidote to this torrent. And I think in the Jobs mythology, in the Jobs version of the story, the intuitiveness and the simplicity of the products themselves was maybe supposed to be a built-in kind of antidote to what would eventually become kind of this unintended consequence of distraction and addiction and all the things that seem to contradict those ideas, those Zen ideas that you described so well. So, one of the ironclad rule of technology is that there are these unintended consequences, and that's kind of what we're living with. And this Apple story is just such a fascinating chapter in this development. I think, as you say, as members of the cult, you kind of get disenchanted. The CEO is not as charismatic anymore. There's this whole notion of being walled off from how the things work, and now there's plenty of alternatives and other companies that are competing with Apple. But the story's kind of set. I mean, we're kind of on this path now, and so the book is kind of a call to retain or maintain some interpretive dignity and integrity, and to think through these things.
Yeah, one question. There's a couple of things that come to mind, but one thing I wanted to ask you about jobs, and this is something like I got from your book that I hadn't really thought about myself or quite read, at least to that degree in the other accounts of Apple, is that some of the appeal of Apple products, their sense of the intuitive, their playfulness, the graphic richness, came not just out of his interest as a designer, so that he approached the computer environment rather than as a boring nerd, as he was also a designer, a graphic designer who cared about design, and that this experience that he and the characters that he corralled were creating was a more multidimensional aesthetic experience. But you point towards the idea that some of that was very consciously done in terms of his own view of the role of intuition and the power of intuition over and against kind of mere rationality or mere reason. Can you talk a little bit about that, like where he got these ideas, and in what way you can see in the design of the technologies some of this attention to the intuitive side of things?
Right. So when he, as a young man, went to India and did his pilgrimage, he noticed among he was looking to talk to gurus and to really explore this interest that he had in Eastern